Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
What's going on, my geeks? Welcome to Midweek Geek here on Geek Therapy Radio. As always, I am your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger, showing you around the museum of our minds. Here's an exhibit, here's an exhibit, here's an exhibit. Just a curator. I'm not an expert in any one of these exhibits, but I know enough to have some fun. But that's where you guys come in. If I miss something, if I misspeak, or maybe there's some more information that needs to be added to any of these exhibits that I show you, by all means, especially if you're watching on YouTube or a format that lets you have a comment section below, let me know, fill in the gaps, because this is a resource where we share knowledge. It's all about sharing knowledge here on Geek Therapy Radio. All I'm trying to do is try to spark something in you. But if you're an expert on anything that I talk about, please comment below. Or if you're just listening to the podcast, go onto Facebook and leave a comment on my Facebook page. It's Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook. So this week's Midweek Geek, I wanted to talk about something that I've kind of been thinking about for a few weeks here. It has to do with Apple. Is Apple's back up against the wall? Is Apple in a position to where they either need to innovate or die? What does Apple have up their sleeve? And before you decide to stop listening to this podcast, or maybe you think this video is not for you because I'm talking about Apple maybe specifically, it's not really specifically about Apple. As you'll see in the end here, it kind of applies to a lot of different aspects of technology that may or may not be following suit, kind of what Apple's doing, because Moore's Law, as we well know, is slowing down. As of 2019, where Moore's Law used to be, since the 60s, around about a doubling in processor power every 18 months to 2 years. Right now, we're at about a doubling of CPU power about every 3 years or so. And case in point, in this applies to the Apple argument I'm going to make here. Intel has been having a really hard time with their 10 nanometer process. We are up against such a wall here with Moore's Law that experts expect an altogether slowdown by the early 2020s. That means unless something revolutionary happens in CPUs and computing before the 2020s, we pretty much will stagnate. For instance, I have in my main PC at home, I have a 4790K, an Intel 4790K. I've got it overclocked to 4.8, 4.9 gigahertz. The 4790K, if you're still rocking a 4790K from 2015 in your gaming setup, you are still doing just fine. CPUs have not advanced that much since 2015, at least on the Intel side. They have, since AMD has come out with Threadripper since then, but that's really just catching up to Intel. Threadripper isn't as good per core as Intel. But that's the point, is CPUs and processing has slowed down so much that if you're still rocking an Intel processor, for instance, from 2015, you are still in really, really good shape here in 2019. And arguably, you may be in pretty good shape into the early 2020s. So in response to this slowdown, what you're seeing is what I call the core wars. It's just Intel adding more cores to their consumer CPUs. That's why you have now you have 6-core CPUs in laptops, mobile. What I'm saying is mobile 6-core CPUs that have wound up, and I guess this is where we're going to get into the Apple argument here, that have wound up kind of biting Apple in the butt. And we will get specifically Apple here. In 2016, Apple rolled out their new MacBook Pro design, the super sexy, super thin, because of Throttlegate and everything like that. We'll get into that in a second. But super thin, super sexy, super aesthetically well-designed pieces of hardware. And at that time, in 2016, Apple wasn't really expecting Intel to hit such a roadblock. They were basically expecting this 10 nanometer process to take hold and to have the small, efficient, less hot chips that they could put in this new sexy thin design. But has that happened? No. Last year, MacBook Pro, famously, the 2018 MacBook Pro 15-inch, tried to cram the i9, the 6-core i9 processor in there, and that's how we got Throttlegate. That slim design that Apple designed in anticipation of smaller nanometer, smaller process Intel chips wound up biting them. So they had almost no choice to try to stay competitive with their competition on the Windows side. They tried to cram in the i9 to that thin little chassis. 6 cores of, what is it? Is it 14 nanometer? Is that what I believe that's correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, or if I don't correct myself in the when I edit the video. But it's not 10 nanometer. It's not 10 nanometers. So we have these big, hot CPUs in this thin Apple chassis. That puts Apple in, stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. And I foresee it going one of 3 ways. Well, really 2 ways, because there's one thing that's for certain. If MacBooks stay with the design and the chassis that they have now, these new 9th generation Intel mobile CPUs with 8 cores, the 9980HK or the 9880H, those are 8-core 16-thread processors. There is no way Apple is going to be able to cram those things inside their current MacBook Pro design. The thermal limitations just will not allow it. It can't work. The laws of physics won't allow it. It's not even about engineering. It's that in that chassis, currently with their heat dissipation setup and heat sinks and everything, they can't do it. They can't handle it. They will be, if they try to do it, it will be severely throttled, just like the i9's in there right now, and may even struggle to achieve base clock, which is what happens with the i9s we have in MacBook Pros right now. So there's no way an 8-core chip's going in there. No way. So Apple has, like I said, one of 3 choices, and we're going to eliminate one right now. One of them is just for Apple to fail. Which, and I've heard some people in the tech space allude to this, that maybe Apple's going to fail. Maybe this is the 2019, 2020. This is just the year that Apple falls behind and fails. No. Apple is worth, they hover around $1 trillion. That's what the company is worth. Apple's not going to fail. It's not like someone's just going to flick the off switch on Apple this year. So we can eliminate the idea that this is the year, because of the new 8-core mobile chips, that this is the year Apple officially falls behind and they fail. That's not going to happen. Apple's not going to fail. So I'm not saying that Apple is too big to fail. Nobody is too big to fail, but there has to be a succession of things done over and over to assure the failure of Apple. They are not a small enough company to where one failure or one mishap is going to bring them down. MacBook Pro and these 8-core Intel processors aren't going to be what brings Apple down. They have to make a succession of failures and mistakes to bring themselves down. It's not happening this year. So we've eliminated that Apple will fail this year. Not happening. Don't listen to anyone who says it will, because it's not. Not this year anyway, and not so soon. So it leaves Apple at a very exciting crossroads here. And I think Apple's going to go one of 2 ways. Matter of fact, I have been in the market for a Mac laptop for a little while now. I've been considering getting a MacBook Pro 13, maybe an Air, just a regular MacBook. But I've been holding off, because I have an iPad. The only Apple device I currently have right now is the 6th generation iPad. I don't have the iPad Pro. I've got an regular iPad 9.7 inch. So I think because of the nature of the show I do, I should have a Mac device that I use regularly. Right now, if I use a MacBook, it's either here at work, I'm tinkering with my bosses, or I might go to a recording studio somewhere and might use a Mac on that end. I don't use Mac OS in my day-to-day life. Am I familiar with it? Yes, I'm familiar enough with it. Am I familiar with Apple laptops, to a certain degree? Yes, because I do use them and interact with them a fair amount throughout the months. But I don't own one myself, and I think I should own one myself. But since Apple is up against this crossroads here, I've been holding my money. I have not jumped on a 13-inch MacBook, 15-inch MacBook Air, anything like that, because Apple is up against such a wall. I think they're at this exciting crossroads, and they're either going to do one or the other this year, and I'm waiting to see. Because if I'm spending money, it's no surprise that it's not news that Apple is significantly more expensive than competition for the same, spec for spec on the PC side. So this year or soon, very soon in the next couple years, either this summer with their they typically announce products in the summertime, so they're either going to do it this year or sometime soon. Apple is either going to not dramatically redesign the MacBook Pros to accommodate the new 8-core processors, because guess what? They're either going to use those new mobile 8-core processors or not. And that or not is something that is very speculative and exciting to me. So Apple's either going to make a new chassis for the MacBook Pro to handle the thermal requirements of the new 8-core chips. That means they might make it a millimeter or two thicker, which I'm all for. And believe me, I think I speak for almost every pro who would probably buy a MacBook Pro, in that we would rather have a thicker device that can thermally handle the components inside it adequately. That is no stretch of the imagination to where we would gladly take an extra millimeter or two or whatever so that we can get every ounce of juice that we're paying for out of a 6-core processor, let alone an 8-core processor. Thottlegate could have been avoided if the boffins over there at Apple would have just made the cooling solution better able to handle the 6-core i9 chip. No, but they kept it. They didn't want to do it. For one thing, it's expensive. A whole redesign just for one refresh of an Intel chip, that's expensive. But I think they have no choice now. To handle these new 8-core chips, if they're going to stay with Intel, wink, wink, they have to make a bigger chassis to handle it. Apple has to change. I'm not going to say innovate. They have to innovate internally. They have to innovate for themselves, because on the Windows side of things, PCs are going to handle these 8-core mobile chips just fine, because they can just build bigger chassis and better cooling solutions. Apple's all about design and sexiness, so they have to come up with something that's sexily designed, but can also handle the output of the 8-core chips. So this year, Apple's either going to redesign the MacBook Pro. Maybe. There's been rumors and speculation about a 16-inch MacBook Pro. Who knows? Or Apple's going to have to ditch Intel entirely. No, they're not going to go to AMD. AMDs don't run any cooler than Intel's. That's for darn sure. If they're not going to go to Intel or AMD, who else can they go to? The plot thickens here. ARM processors, Qualcomm, something like that. We know that Apple has been hinting at, and they have mentioned that they would like to get off of Intel chips altogether by the early 2020s. Is 2019 the year they do it? Maybe. We've seen the capabilities of the iPad Pros in their, A12X Bionic chips they have in there, and that they're bringing some full-fat desktop applications to it. I think they're going to bring Adobe to it. Oh, what's the other one? I think it's a CAD program. Don't quote me directly on that, but they're bringing full-fat desktop versions of programs to the actual iPad Pro. It's not just app versions. It's not just stripped-down mobile versions. So, will the new MacBook Pros, either in 2019 or very soon here, is 2019 the year that they switch over to their own in-house chips, their own in-house CPUs? For those of you who are younger, Apple used to make their own processors. When did they switch over? I want to say in the 2000s or so, they switched to using Intel. But Apple's no stranger historically to making their own processors. Will they return to form here in around the early 2020s or even this year in 2019? That's to be seen. If they do that, here's one reason why they would do it. Apple's also been on the hunt for a unified Mac ecosystem. That means no more Mac OS, no more iOS, just one AOS or Apple operating system. That means on your iPad, your iPhone, or your MacBook Pro, you're using the same operating system across the board. We know that Apple wants to get to that level of integration. Is the first major step forward towards that end happening this year in 2019? Is it happening this summer? Possibly. Very, very possibly. That is not so far-fetched. My concern is, and forgive me if I sound kind of ignorant for saying this, but x86 programs. How would you I'll use a good example here. Pro Tools and Adobe Premiere. Both of those softwares, both of those programs work on Windows machines and on Mac machines, Apple machines. If they go to a proprietary CPU, will Premiere, the conversion process, will it have to be written completely different? Are there programs that will not be able to run on Mac anymore that could run on both platforms? And I'm pausing here because that's a real concern. You can't just, for instance, I can't install Pro Tools on my Android device. It's an ARM, it's a Qualcomm chip. You can't do it. It's a completely different architecture. So how would that affect architecture and programming and making programs in the future? And will you not be able to run certain programs that you've relied on in the past if Apple goes to their own proprietary chipset and CPU? Who knows? An interesting side note to all of this is that Microsoft has been porting versions of Windows 10 to ARM for a little while now, at least a year or so. But as I understand it now, most of that is it's basically ARM processors emulating the x86 environment from Intel processors. It's basically an emulator. It's just an ARM chip running an emulator, Windows emulator. Will that change over to native? I know they're still working on making it native. But that's very interesting. If Microsoft has been already tinkering with ARM processors and tinkering with that architecture, could they have already been in cahoots with Apple this whole time? And the reason I bring that up is because if Apple goes to their own proprietary chipset based on the A12X or 13X, whatever they're going to call it, what about Boot Camp? You can install Windows on a Mac rather easily. It's very hard to install Mac OS on a PC. It's a nightmare, but you can do it. I'm just saying it's much easier to install Windows on a Mac via Boot Camp. So if Apple goes to its own processor, own chipset, what about Boot Camp? Are they just going to eliminate the ability to run Windows altogether on Apple devices? Which makes me go back to that point I just made. Perhaps, what if, has Microsoft been in cahoots with Apple this whole time behind the scenes, making a version of Windows 10 that will run flawlessly on any proprietary CPU that Apple has up its sleeve? And that could be revolutionary. It's revolutionary because if Apple starts making high-end desktop class chipsets and CPUs, that will change the game because it's no longer a struggling Intel. It's no longer AMD. Now you have player 3 entering the match. Very interesting. We could be in a revolutionary time. And what effect is that going to have on Moore's law going into the early 2020s? Could these new chips be so power efficient and so much more powerful? Is Apple sitting on not Pandora's box necessarily, but are they sitting on a Moore's law revolution? Quantum computing? I'm not saying it's necessarily quantum computing or something like that, but something has to change drastically and revolutionarily for Moore's law to speed back up again, for us to get doubling in processing power every 2 years, every 18 months again. Right now, like I said, it's at three years or so. Is Apple, do they hold the key to a revolution and a re-energizing of Moore's law? Maybe? I don't know. Back to my point, and we'll start wrapping this up because I know this is long, guys, but there's a lot of concepts kind of to get to here. So I appreciate anyone still watching this, because I know if you're listening to a podcast, you may still be listening to it. People tend to listen to podcasts a lot longer than they watch YouTube videos, that's for sure. But when I was saying that Microsoft could have been in cahoots with Apple this whole time behind the scenes, by the way that they're dabbling in ARM processors right now, that much we do know. And Apple has said that they want to go to their own proprietary CPUs in the very near future. Could Apple and Microsoft have been working the whole time together behind the scenes? Do you remember the NVIDIA Shield tablet? You do remember the Nintendo Switch because that is still relevant. But the Nintendo Switch is powered by an NVIDIA SoC. That's the X1, I believe. Don't exactly quote me on that, but it is NVIDIA SoC powering the Nintendo Switch. A few years before the Nintendo Switch came out is when NVIDIA released the NVIDIA Shield tablet and portable and Shield TV. But I'm talking about the Shield tablet specifically. I still have one. It's still wonderful in 2019. I think that was NVIDIA's testbed as they made the pitch to Nintendo to buy NVIDIA chips to let NVIDIA power the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo had used ATI. ATI is not even around anymore in the past. So basically, NVIDIA rolled out this kind of it wasn't beta. We weren't the testers for it, but they released the they released the NVIDIA Shield tablet as a test bed to see if it would work in tablet form and be powerful enough and run powerful enough games or whatnot. And it was it was their like live pitch to Nintendo. So I don't think it's far-fetched that Windows releasing some devices, even now in modern day, some tablets that are running Windows 10 or 2-in-1s running Windows 10 on an ARM-based processor, on a Qualcomm processor. Windows is already tinkering with ARM processors. Microsoft is already tinkering with ARM processors. Have they been tinkering with Apple this whole time? That's interesting to think about. So I think 2019, this is the year. This is my prediction that Apple not necessarily changes the game, but changes their game. If not, they have to make MacBook Pros bigger and thicker to accommodate the new 8-core chips, which I'm all for. I am all for making a bigger MacBook Pro to handle 8 cores. That would make complete sense. And I guess that wraps it up. But what do you guys think? I put out a whole lot of information here. If you're watching on YouTube, let her rip in the comments below. What do you think that Apple has up their sleeves this year? Do you think I'm maybe kind of even in the same county of the ballpark here? Maybe not, yes or no. If you have a different opinion, let me know below. If you think that there's some truth to what I'm on about here, let me know below as well. Throw a like on there. Please consider subscribing. I'm on my hunt for 1,000 subs here in 2019. So if you even consider subscribing, that means the world to me. If you're listening to the podcast or watching on YouTube, it's the same here. My message is the same. Please be good to each other, especially yourself. Embrace your geek thing, because we are all geeks about something, no matter what it is. Cross-stitching to bodybuilding to remote control cars to building gaming PCs. We are all geeks about something, so embrace it. Be good to yourself. And yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you guys in the next one here on Geek Therapy Radio.